I talk about world building and writing techniques for crafting speculative fiction. And if you're interested in seeing those episodes, check out the links in the video description below. With that out of the way, it's time for part 3 of how to write speculative fiction.
You got the touch. You got the power. Yeah!
Hello and welcome to But I Digress, the show where sometimes my mouth goes faster than my brain. I am your host, Nathan, call me Nate Marchand. And welcome, as I said, to part 3 of how to write speculative fiction. Now that you know how the craft is done, it's time to learn what the kinds of stories that you can write in this particular field. Because trust me, it will not only help you focus on what kind of story that you want to tell, it'll also help you to figure out what audience that you want to write to and what their expectations may be, and what kinds of publishers that you want to deal with. Because telling them what kind of story that you have will help them to determine if your story is a good fit for their publishing house or for their magazine. And it will also help you to figure out which ones that you want to work with. Now, this week I will be focusing on the speculative fiction genre of fantasy, which I will admit, when I was doing the research for this video, I found out that fantasy is actually a broader genre than I originally gave it credit for. How broad are you may be asking? Well, let's go on a journey and find out. First up is high or epic fantasy. For most people who are not aficionados of the genre, these are the sorts of stories that come to their minds when you mention fantasy to them. These are the stories with the multiple peoples and races and the big detailed worlds that were created in their entirety before the authors even started writing their stories. I'm not kidding. They did all that world building so that they know the geography and the history and all those things about the world before they even set out to do it. In fact, there's a joke that goes around that Tolkien started writing his stories just to justify the Elvish language that he had invented. Now, these worlds, because they have such these stories, since they have such huge worlds, also usually come with maps, particularly if this is in book form, so that way readers can reference the maps to find out where the characters are and where they're trying to get to. And speaking of characters, high and epic fantasy stories usually have large casts of characters, that all of whom have stories that interconnect and interweave, creating one massive epic. Now, the most famous example of this sort of a story is one you probably are already familiar with. It's hard to avoid because these books have become a part of pop culture. And that is, not surprisingly, Lord of the Rings. I mean, come on. Did you expect me to do another video in this series and not mention Lord of the Rings? I already said it's my favorite book of all time. Regardless, this has everything I just talked about. The massive world, the massive detailed world, the huge cast of characters, maps. I mean, in fact, there is a whole section of this book that's nothing but appendices telling you all this extra information that you don't need to know to enjoy the story or understand it, but it's there anyway in case you're curious. So, if your plan is to write high or an epic fantasy, this is required reading if you haven't read it already. Now, I do want to say one more thing about this. There have been a lot of people over the years who have tried to be little Tolkiens, and most of the time it doesn't work. So do yourself and everyone else a favor. Don't try to be Tolkien light. Be yourself and write your own masterpiece. Another popular subgenre is dark fantasy. These are fantasy stories that include elements of horror, so they have monsters and demons and the occult, things like that. And they have gloomy or Gothic atmospheres. And believe it or not, actually some of them are told from the perspective of the monster as opposed to the hero. For example, and this has been done a couple of times for what I understand, the story of Beowulf has been retold from Grendel's point of view as opposed to Beowulf himself. Now, a few more recent examples of dark fantasy would include Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Now, this is Stephen King we're talking about here, who most call the modern master of literary horror. So if he was going to write fantasy, yeah, you would expect it to be dark fantasy and include a lot of elements of horror. Now, another example is one that I unfortunately don't have physical copies with me, and that is the Sandman comics by Neil Gaiman, which are all about the Dream King and his attempts to reestablish his kingdom after being absent for a long time. Deals a lot with the occult and other such things. And they're comics that I've been told for years are ones that I should read, but I haven't quite gotten around to it yet. But I promise they're on my reading list. The next subgenre that I want to discuss is one that normally I don't think I would bring up, but there's an example of this that is insanely popular right now, so I kind of have to bring it up. And that is court intrigue fantasy. These are fantasy stories that are set in royal castles, and they usually deal with royal families and matters of state, and they have either a historical setting but with magic, or they're set in a recognizable alternate world. Now, from that little description, have you been able to figure out what that insanely popular example is? Well, for those of you who haven't, it is, ta-da! Game of Thrones. Oh yeah, the book series by George R.R. Martin where nobody is safe. So don't get attached to any of the characters, they'll probably end up dead. It's almost as if George R.R. Martin writes his manuscripts on pages from a death note. Regardless, this is honestly the only example of court intrigue fantasy that I can find, so if you know of any others, please let me know in the comments below. The next subgenre that I want to discuss is one that was popularized by the pulp magazines in the 1920s and 1930s, and that is sword and sorcery. These are stories that are generally characterized by, no surprise, sword-wielding characters in violent conflicts. These stories usually have elements of romance, magic, and the supernatural. For example, a common template for these sorts of stories could be your swordsman hero who is fighting a cult of black mages in order to save the buxom woman that he loves that week. But what really distinguishes sword and sorcery from other forms of fantasy, in particular high and epic fantasy, is that it focuses on more personal battles. Whereas epic fantasy usually has big stakes involving the fate of the world, in sword and sorcery stories, the characters are generally doing things like fighting for their own survival or to rescue somebody. Now, there is a really famous example of this. It's a series of stories that I have to admit are a bit of a guilty pleasure for me because they focus on a character who knows what is best in life.
What daring! What outrageousness! What arrogance! I salute you.
Conan the Barbarian.
Yes, Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard, an author who may have single-handedly invented the entire subgenre of sword and sorcery. This next subgenre is one that was popular for a long time with the YA crowd, and that is urban fantasy. These are stories that obviously take place in a city or an urban environment. However, there's a lot of breadth to that because these urban settings can be historical, they can be present day, or they can be futuristic. So you have a lot of options there. But what really distinguishes it is that you have fantastical elements that exist within this urban environment. For example, you could have a story where a werewolf lives in an abandoned subway station, or you have earthbound mythological beings. Now, when I was doing my research, I thought of an example for this, and it's a popular one. I'm not sure it's one that people would necessarily label urban fantasy, but I would. And that is Percy Jackson and the Olympians by Rick Riordan. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. In this one, the young hero discovers that the Greek pantheon and other mythological creatures are not only exist, but they live among us. For example, Medusa, irony of ironies, is a supermodel. At least she was in the movie. Now, there's another really popular example of this, and it involves high school girls, vampires, werewolves, and love triangles. What? You were expecting something else? This next subgenre is one that is difficult to define, even though it's one that I really enjoy, and that is science fantasy. The only way to really describe it is that these are stories that use elements and tropes from both fantasy and science fiction, which can make for a really weird marriage and often really strange stories, albeit fun ones. This is especially strange when you take, say Rod Serling's definitions of both fantasy and science fiction, where he said science fiction was the impossible made probable, and fantasy was the improbable made possible. And to compound matters, science fantasy is a subgenre that kind of has subgenres within itself, so it just makes it even more difficult to peg. It's easier to describe it using examples. Say, for instance, A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs and its film adaptation John Carter. Or my all-time favorite childhood cartoon, Thundercats. Oh! Anyway, this was a series that really it had it all. It had robots and spaceships and magic and elementals. I mean, it had everything and combined it in a, for the most part, seamless fashion. And it also might explain how I have the crazy mind that I have now. But wait, true believers, these are not the only subgenres of fantasy that are out there. Want to see some more? Well, I'll show you with some magic of my own. Wata! The magic of video editing. These were other subgenres that I ran into while I was doing my research. As you can see, you have a lot to pick from. It's not that these were unimportant, they were just less common. So, if you're interested in writing any of these kinds of stories, I recommend doing a little bit of research on your own. I didn't feel that they were common enough for me to go into copious detail in this video. Alright, regardless, now you might be asking yourself, what about fantasy's cousin science fiction? Well, don't worry, sci-fi fans and writers, your day is coming. And join me next time for part 4 of How to Write Speculative Fiction, where I will be talking about the subgenres of science fiction. Until then, thank you for joining me this week on But I Digress. This is Nate Marchand, signing off. Ready and action. This next subgenre that I want to discuss is one that is difficult to define, even though it's one that I really enjoy, and that is science fantasy. These are the only way.